is a panel. Natural resources, we just finished with the question by Sibyl that really raises this issue. But natural resources is not only about oil and gas. Every single province in Canada exploits natural resources, being forestries, fisheries, agriculture, mining, and oil and gas. So it's all around the country. And one of the questions as we were trying to construct this forum was to say, what are questions that will resonate across Canada? One of the interesting things also of natural resources is that it's not only centered on the big cities, it's happening in the regions, in remote places, so it touches all of Canada, and of course with jobs also in the big centers. So it's really a field domain that is of high importance, I would say, both economically but structurally, socially across Canada. So the question was, as we embark on reducing greenhouse gas emission, but also as climate change is taking place with adaptation and all this, how will natural resource sectors be affected? What will be the opportunities? What will be the challenges? What will be the disturbances? So those are very easy questions that we're asking the 4 panelists today. So they will really be, they will have no problem, I'm sure, answering these questions. So we have 4 great panelists to answer these questions. You see their name here behind me. So each panelist will have about 5 minutes to first expose their position, and then I'll ask a few questions, and I invite you to feed in questions as we go along. And if your questions, in preference, I will kind of try to mix my questions with your questions to have the most participation possible. So I don't know, Alexander, can you put the all the panelists at the forefront?
Oui, tout à fait.
Alexander, tu peux mettre les panélistes de l'avant, s'il te plaît? And we will start with Elaine Wheaton. So we'll start by inverse alphabetical order. Elaine Wheaton is a climate scientist. She's an adjunct professor at the University of Saskatchewan and the Geography and Planning Department. She works on climate change, adaptation, risk, and vulnerabilities. She has extensive international experience, and she's part of the IPCC, so she shares the 2007 Nobel Prize for this work. She's had a number of other awards, and she's published an award-winning book, but it's Dry Cold, Weathering the Canadian Prairies. So that shows a breadth of interest. So I will first start with Elaine, and then we'll go in inverse alphabetical order.
Thank you. Can you hear me all right?
Absolutely.
Thank you. So first of all, thank you for the opportunity to be here today and working on this panel as well. So my job here is to discuss agriculture across Canada. I'll focus on the prairies because I have most experience and expertise in the prairie region, and in fact the Great Plains region of North America. So I just want to remind everyone that first of all, my vision for agriculture is a very well adapted sector, and it has possibilities for many benefits for not only the farmers like myself, I have a conflict of interest here, but also society, economy, and the environment. So the goal is this agricultural endeavor that's resilient to quite a rapidly changing and highly variable climate. And that is very true in Canada, especially in the Canadian prairies, where we already have had a rapidly very variable climate. So climate scientists and others, including economists and also psychologists in terms of values, have been assessing the impacts and adaptation, and indeed vulnerability in terms of climate change for quite some time now. So, but we do realize that the adaptation of agriculture will be stressed by several aspects, such as the rapidity of climate change and the surprises So I just want to let you know that the next phase of Canada's National Assessment of Climate Change will be regarding impacts. Adaptation will be released soon. So I refer you to that as well. So the next portion, quickly in my rest of my few minutes here, is to outline some challenges and opportunities for agriculture in climate change. So starting with the challenges, there is that increasing risk of hazards, and that's already being mentioned in the UK aspect, and that is a great deal of worry. And those hazards that agriculture is especially exposed to and sensitive to are drought, and drought all across Canada, not in the prairie, not just in the prairies. Heat aspects, and we've had an example of that earlier in the prairies, where several days of quite strong heat wave have really reduced the crop yields and caused damage to the soil moisture, and also the grasslands. And of course, we also look at storms and hail and wind. Concern to note is that some of these hazards can be overlapping, heat plus some other storms. So then there are many indirect effects of climate change, which really must be addressed as well. In fact, those are some of the research gaps. And those include such as health effects on farmers, not only the heat, but the disease such as West Nile virus, for example, especially noticeable for people who work outside a lot. And then there are the interactions of climate change with insects, disease, as I mentioned, weeds, and those effects on livestock, which we don't seem to have as much much information on. And of course, fire, because not only the boreal forest is affected by fire, but also our grasslands. And you certainly don't want your combine, it's very expensive combine, burned up, and that can happen. So another challenge is examining the effects of climate change on agricultural sustainability. The sustainability of agriculture and of the environment that supports agriculture is really affected again by those the hazards such as drought, and also excessive precipitation, the very intense rainfall that causes a lot of soil erosion and flooding of the crops and grassland, for instance. So those are some of the main challenges regarding impacts of climate. I'll just talk about a little bit about the challenges relating to adaptation.
1 minute.
Okay, so those are things such as changing insurance. Insurance is a strong adaptation aspect, and impacts in other countries. We have to adapt to that, and the need to make transformational changes. So I'll briefly look at some opportunities. Those opportunities, by the way, are related to each one of those challenges I mentioned. There is the possibility of increasing crop yields and crop types. We clearly see that. And some of the increasing crop yields are related to carbon dioxide fertilization. So we have to understand much more about that. So there are increasing climatic resources for agriculture, including longer and hotter growing seasons. And that leads to the possibility of having a greater diversity of crops and indeed of livestock. So there's the changing demands for food, fiber, and fuel. Biomass was brought up before. Changing labor and investment markets. And so those are some key opportunities and challenges. Agriculture is a very a vital part of the economy and society all across Canada, and also has a strong role in environmental sustainability. So there you go. There are many research gaps, all documented, but for another time.
Thank you very much. Le prochain paneliste est Rémi Morin Chassé. He was an assistant professor of economics at the University of Prince Edward Island before joining Université du Québec at Chicoutimi in 2018. So he's a fresh one at Chicoutimi. He has a PhD in economics from the University of Wyoming. He's focusing his research on environmental and resource economics. And he's also a former chair and current member of the Canadian Resource and Environmental Economics Association Executive Committee. Donc, Rémi.
Bonjour à tous. Hi, everybody. So I prepared a few slides to, can everyone hear me right? Testing
Yes.
New setup. Okay, so I've got a few slides on sort of my thinking on climate change and the key issues in Canada right now in terms of resource extraction related to environmental economics. So let me see if that works. Okay, so here we are. With climate change comes, adaptation and mitigation. What do we want? Well, there will be some policies to try to mitigate GHG emissions that will change people's behavior, that will change firms' behavior, and that's exactly what we want. As an economist, we want to be able to achieve our climate objective in the most efficient way possible, trying to have as few loss in the way, and create as much welfare reaching these climate objectives. So what have we proposed? And it's been out for many decades now. GHG pricing, we need to be able to price something that has a cost, and there's an externality. So what do? Well, create a market, right? But there are certainly management costs that are issues, various uncertainties on prices, or how are you able to reach the target? There are carbon leakages issues where you have different jurisdictions with different ways to tackle climate change. You also have a green paradox, which is sort of a neat little idea. Well, it's not that neat, but if you have some legislation that's going to come forward, are people going to adapt? I think it's going to be worse than the cure itself. And it's in how to think about fighting climate change and natural resource in Canada. Well, for a lot of people out there, taxes are a no-no. And well, it's too bad. It's too bad because they're usually associated with lower management costs. So what do we have? We have standards. So there's a new clean fuel standard that's being put forward by the government of Canada. Is it good? Is it bad? I'll leave that to someone else. But certainly that's going to impact people and firms and different opportunities. And is it going to be more costly than a tax? Well, maybe, I don't know, but it's better that than nothing, right? So in terms of natural resource extraction in Canada, what came to mind really is the link between climate change and its impacts on biological and ecological processes. So you have various species that are at risk, ecosystem services that are going to be affected. How are we going to deal with that in trying to promote a sustainable way to manage, natural resource use or extractions of non-renewable resources? It is an issue, right? You have new challenges that come with climate change, like permafrost thawing. You'll have species migration, like we just saw with caribou. You'll have new pests and diseases. So that's a map of the mountain pine beetle outbreak from early 2000s to the mid 2010s, and still going on. And how it could spread. It's been associated with there's a lot of dead trees. And with climate change and warmer summers and drier summers, forest fires are popping around. So it's a big issue there, and it's going to be impacting the way that we as Canadians manage our natural resources. It's going to be impacting managers in the government, but also private firms extracting natural resources up north in remote regions, because there's an increase in risk, and it's been mentioned before, but it's something that is also I think it's a topic that I believe is really important. So climate change brings, challenges, but also opportunities. You'll have new resources in new regions that will be could be developed, but you'll have that issue with remoteness and risk. So you have here Canadian Coast Guard Services ship here at the Northwest Passage, and that's one of the issue, right? You'll have these perhaps new resources to be extracted. Should they be extracted? How do you ship them out? Well, there needs to be a careful risk assessment around these issues. And well, I guess it's not just us if it's an international passage, but it's certainly an issue that climate change just is bringing to the forefront here, because how are we going to be able to manage a natural accident, environmental accident up in a remote region? And that's a question that's left, for open. There's a new expanded desire for preservation as well. I know in Quebec it's a big deal, where we have protected areas. There's a goal for protected areas in northern Quebec, but at the same time there's the Plan Nord, which is supposed to be developing resources as well. So how can you, on one hand protect areas, and at the same time you want to develop them? So there's certainly opportunities for researchers how to reconciliate these two things, how to identify regions to protect, identify regions that you could develop. So reconciliating these desires will dictate resource development and management in Canada, I think. And one last, I think I mentioned that before. One last thing is the link with First Nations in Canada. The Supreme Court ruled a couple of times now that they must be consulted prior to development project that might affect their constitutionally protected rights. It's the Crown's duty to consult, and that may yield a duty to accommodate. And that research, development, and management cannot ignore this. There might be a way for sustainable co-management of natural resource use, extraction, etc. So these are topics that I believe are key to natural resource use and extraction in Canada for the next couple of years.
Merci, Rémi.
Oui.
The next panelist is Warren Mabee, who is a Canada researcher and professor in the Department of Geography and Planning at Queen's University. He's executive director of the School of Policy Study. He's been involved in the development of bioenergy, biofuel technologies. That's one of his great area of research. He's done this work in collaboration with the International Energy Agency, the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations. So he's focused really at the interface between renewable energy policy and technology. So Warren.
Thanks very much. I hope everybody can hear me. And,
yes, that's good.
I'm enjoying the discussion so far. Elaine did a terrific job of introducing some of the challenges that we're facing. Elaine was talking about it specific to agriculture, but you can expand that to forestry, which is where I'm going to focus a lot of my comments today. And Rémi, you've introduced some of the policies and talked a little bit about some of those extraction opportunities and issues, particularly in the north. So I do want to dive into really where some of those policies take us and into some of the opportunities that I see around forestry and the bioeconomy in general. All around the world, we are seeing policies that are pushing consumers and pushing companies to choose greener feedstocks, greener options. A lot of these policies have really focused on energy and energy consumption. That may be a challenge, as we can talk about. But it presents a big opportunity for Canada because Canada is the steward to vast boreal forests and temperate forests across almost all of our provinces. We have the potential to expand production of biomass and production of bioproducts. We have the potential to support a much bigger and more robust bioeconomy than we do now. And those policies are what's going to push us towards those decisions, those opportunities. I do think that there are quite a few challenges in the way. There are challenges around sustainability of a bioeconomy. And, you know, the plain and hard and sort of ugly truth is that there's not enough biomass in the world to support an economy that looks like the economy we have today. You know, we cannot have a pure bioeconomy that replaces everything that we do unless we introduce some strong circular elements to that economy. And that means a lot more reuse, a lot more recycling, a lot more recovery of materials. We need to be able to use individual fibers, not just once or twice, but maybe dozens of times across many different applications in order to be able to supply the materials and ultimately the energy that we require. The changing climate is going to affect Canadian forests. We are going to see more fires. We are going to see more insect outbreaks. We are dealing with things like mountain pine beetle, but also with things like emerald ash borer and other pests that are dramatically changing the types of trees that we have access to and dramatically changing, I think, our approaches to silviculture as we go forward. There are ways that we can respond to that, but some of those responses are going to be challenging under our current policy regime. So we have a very, very strong conservation regime that we've built over many, many years across Canada that control and manage our forest applications. It's a regime that has done a lot of good things. It's reduced some of the over-exploitation that we had seen. It has introduced sustainability as a core tenet of the forest industry, but it is not a regime that is particularly flexible in the face of a changing climate. And so, if the first thing I want to get in your heads is circular bioeconomy is a big opportunity, the second thing I want to get into your heads is that we don't have the kind of adaptive management framework in place, particularly when you start looking at those top-down policies, that's probably going to be required for us to adapt and manage our forests going forward. We're going to have to start opening those things up. And that is a risky thing to do, a dangerous thing to do. We've gone through long periods of, back and forth discussion and debate over where our forest policies should be and how strict they should be. To go back and say, well, we might not have them exactly right and we need to change them up again, invites a whole new round of debate and discussion. I'm really glad that Rémi introduced the idea of First Nations and Indigenous peoples, because this is going to be critical for any future pathway for our forests and for our bioeconomy. I see Indigenous peoples, First Nations across this country becoming bigger and bigger players in that industry, and indeed bringing a lot of knowledge and practice to the table that I think can really help us to move forward. The big challenge that I see, and the third thing I want you to take away today, is that our policies to support a bioeconomy are heavily focused on energy. And maybe rightly so. Our big concern right now is greenhouse gases. And so most of the policies that we're writing are about how to reduce greenhouse gas impacts, and therefore mostly about replacing or substituting different forms of energy. But the biggest opportunities with the forest and with the forest bioeconomy, I think, are with materials. New biomaterials, new construction materials. We're starting to see really exciting proposals for super tall wooden buildings, for new materials that can go into textiles, for new materials that can replace some of the plastics that we're using out there. But the support mechanisms and the policies that we've seen at the federal and provincial level still focus primarily on energy. And energy is not a high enough value product to really drive the transition forward. So if the big opportunity is around a circular bioeconomy, if our big challenges have to do with policy managing the forest, it's also policy in developing that new bioeconomy sector. We need to really look at what our end goal is. And developing this green economy and this sustainable economy is about more than just replacing our energy sources and changing up our energy sources. In fact, arguably, the most important thing that we can do is move to better and better materials that can sequester carbon over very long periods, that can be reutilized again and again in different applications. So I see these as being the big challenges or opportunities. I'm not going to talk too much more right now. I can see my 5 minutes are almost up, but I'm going to hand over to the next person on our panel. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Warren. And the last speaker will be, last panelist will be Kevin Byrne, who is Vice President, North American Crude Oil Markets at IHS Markit. He's based in Calgary and he leads the Western Canadian Crude Oil Market Research Services. His expertise is in North American crude oil markets, on logistics, on Canadian oil sands development, and he has authored a number of reports related to Western crude oil extraction and related also to environmental and climate policy. So Kevin, you have 5 minutes.
Thank you. And I'd just like to say I really enjoyed the forestry remarks. I began my career promoting Canadian forestry. You know, I'm an economist by training, focused on the oil market and oil market fundamentals. I'm going to address my comments from that perspective and provide some comment and some background in the sector as a whole. When I look at the Canadian oil and gas sector, I believe there's two things. There's a number of misconceptions about the sector, but there's also real challenges and real risks, including physical risks associated with energy transition. On the misconceptions, there's also some unique characteristics you got to consider that the sector is competing in. And I think one thing I'd urge caution around, you know, conflating COVID-19 impacts as impacts or towards the potential impacts of energy transition on the sector. And I want to touch on that briefly to give some folks about, you know, the volatility in the market that we've seen this year. I think assuredly as 2019, it would have been a poor predictor for this year. 2020 is probably going to be a poor predictor for 2021 and beyond. The impacts we saw this year on the front half of the year from the COVID was rapid, it was acute, and it was incredibly dramatic. Over that second quarter, so as we rolled into March, and in a matter of a few weeks, we saw about a quarter of global oil demand vaporize. We're talking weeks. And, you know, the other way to think about it is in that same period when we saw those photos of empty streets around the world, 75% of oil demand continued, which is also a sign of how ubiquitous this material is. The response in Canada was incredibly profound. It's probably the single largest shock we've seen to the sector. Within that beginning of that second quarter, we saw over $8 billion US removed from planned spending in energy generally, not just upstream, but the entire energy component. And we saw over 750,000 barrels temporarily shut in, just shy of maybe a quarter of Canadian output or Western Canadian output. Since the lows of that second quarter, we've seen oil demand rebound by about 90%. And we believe that demand is now in a position that it's above supply globally, and we're seeing inventories drop. Now, this is an important part. This is brought about not just by demand recovery, but production being shut in that response, but also natural declines. From the moment new production is brought online in oil and gas, for majority of plays around the world, it enters decline. Some assets can lose over 50% of their output within 1 calendar year. This means for an oil company, if you're not investing in new projects, you're already in decline. And that's what we're seeing this year. We're seeing declines around the world from oil producers. And in fact, the majority of activity in oil and gas is actually meant or targeting reserve replacement, not meeting incremental demand growth. Now, this is an important characteristic when you think about the global oil market and the long-term implications of energy transition and what this could mean for the sector. When we look at Canada specifically, the majority of production comes from the oil sands. But in terms of composition, there's actually hundreds of smaller producers and service companies. And it's these service companies that really are the folks that drill the wells, pump the oil, build the roads, and make sure that product gets to market. And these are the folks that you find in those rural communities. And I think there were some comments about that earlier. And they take it the hardest in the volatile market. Simply put, there's no wells to drill, there's no oil to pump, and they don't have a job to go to in this environment. For the oil sands itself, I think one of the misconceptions is there is a significant large upfront out-of-pocket investment required to bring on new operations, but it takes far less to maintain that output. In most of our transition scenarios at IHS Markit, the oil sands is quite resilient because it doesn't have these pronounced decline rates compared to other assets, and the cost to hold what you've got is a lot less than the cost to bring it on. Now, there are real challenges energy transition poses for the oil sector. But in all scenarios, we do see demand continuing through to 2050. It's a question of which scenario is accurate, how fast is that curve going to look like, and who's going to supply that market. And for the Canadian oil sector to be successful, it has to adapt in my view. It needs to dramatically lower its emission intensity, which is a key metric that the financial community is leaning in on the oil companies to deliver on, to understand and rank and rate the investment profiles, but also to understand the risks of any transition to them. Within Canada, we have incredible variability in the emissions that we have in our portfolio from Western Canada all the way to the offshore. And it's going to be easier and harder for some. There's going to be winners and losers. And the other thing is many companies are going to need to diversify, both vertically into the value chains to bring a barrel of oil through to sequestered petrochemical products, but also into other forms of energy and fuel. And then there's reputational issues, and that's going to really require performance over time. I think another thing I would like to talk about is that the industry, a lot of people think it's not a profitable sector. And certainly this year it is not because of the, the externality of the incredible pandemic we've seen. But in 2019, we did see significant revenue coming from the oil sands, with the majors generating over, on average, $3 billion each. I see some nervousness about my time, so I'm going to cut it short. I think I'd just like to touch on the fact that we do see the industry responding to these pressures, and there is an incredible perfect storm around them in terms of investor disillusionment, pressures around transition, and also this sheer volatility we've seen over the last 5 years. Many companies have advanced their own net zero ambitions, but they, like the broader Canadian economy, are going to require all the tools in the toolbox and all the bright minds and all the solutions from our economy and around the world to be able to deliver on that. If they aren't able to compete, and if they're impaired in their ability to compete, we could see them disproportionately impacted versus their peers. There is a risk here, a real risk of carbon leakage. And so foregoing those potential benefits and not really having a material impact to global emissions. So I'll leave it there. Sorry I ran over.
Thank you. Thank you to all. There's already a few questions. So just before letting the floor for the participants, I would like to have a question coming back on the regions, because it's also natural resources is also affecting the regions. You mentioned it a bit, but as climate warms, clearly, no, you can also expect people moving up north. So there will be reuse, change of use of sort of the land, but also as part of sustainability, and a few people mentioned it, you mentioned it, Warren, for the wood. Are there also, what's happening in terms of products we will need, for example? What would be the effect? So if you have, and each of you, a few words on what will be the effect on the regions and how to, do you see transformation that will take place, risk or problems? I know it's a broad question, but anybody wants to start? Warren?
I can start a little bit. I do think that when we look at impacts on forestry, that the bigger impacts will be seen in the West. And the East doesn't get off scot-free, but because there's a good combination of water, extended growing season, things like that, we may actually see some upticks in productivity in the East that'll be matched by some downticks in productivity in the West. I think in the West, we've got some big challenges, particularly with the temperate rainforest. Changes in rainfall there are going to put a lot of stress on that forest, and there's going to be strong conservation efforts put into kind of saving that. I think that you're absolutely right that we're going to see uptake of jobs and opportunities in the north as we move forward. But we have to remember that the winters are going to remain harsh. You know, we may have very hot summers and very cold winters. So what we're actually going to need is, you know, better architecture, better designs for that kind of living. And one good place to start on that is to look at the shameful state of the reserves, the Indigenous communities. We could be doing so much more with architecture and with materials. And you talk about a showcase to move these things forward. I think there's an awesome opportunity there.
Thank you. Anybody wants to add something? Yes, Elaine.
Thanks for your question, Elaine. In terms of agriculture in Canada, in the prairies in the west, there's limited capability to move northward because of problems with soils. But I do see quite a bit of change in the land use, and we are already seeing that with the lengthening growing season to different types of crops, more diversity of crops, better rotation. And then when you look at interactions with, say, energy, we could have more biomass production and also more wind and solar energy on the farms, especially in the Canadian prairies because of all the wind and solar capabilities. So look to see some amazing changes in land use.
Thank you. Other comments? Yeah, Rémi?
In terms of natural resources and regions, I mean, I think there's going to be an impact for coastal regions where you have, fisheries will be impacted with respect to climate change. As I mentioned, I think quickly, there might be new species. Lobsters, I remember reading that, you know, lobster might be moving a little bit north, so that could be a good thing for people out east, I suppose, and for all of us. And then in terms of wood, I don't know if Warren could agree, but there could be, you know, with the different clean fuel standards, there could be opportunities in regions for renewable natural gas coming from wood residue, possibly, as long as, you know, there's always the case of economic viability, but there could be opportunities that way, you know, in terms of regions up north. Of course, there's big project here in Saguenay with liquefied natural gas that could be exported, coming up from the west and being exported elsewhere. These are, you know, big projects that are good or bad, I don't know, but they're there, right? And these are the types of projects that might come up and that we'll have to stop and think and see how they fare in the bigger picture.
Thank you. Kevin, you have something to say?
Not specifically on this one. Most of it's, a lot of the oil and gas sector is involved in rural communities, and certainly the changes in temperature are going to impact the access to certain parts of the current activities, and in terms of changing the softness of the soil and when they usually go through in the winter and harder surfaces and stuff like that. I can't think, it's not an area of my expertise. Okay. Sorry.
Thanks. Graham Reed, you had a question?
Yeah, Anin, Bojo, Graham Reed, Indigenous Cause, Otto and Unjaban, Mabee and Dow. It's good to join.
Camera.
I think my camera's on.
Ah, okay, so okay.
Yeah, yeah, you just need to pin me. It's good to join, I guess, this virtual circle from Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh lands. What's, I guess, assumed to be now Vancouver. I have a few just comments. And then, you know, I guess I would reflect and ask the panelists to reflect on a question. But I'm struck by how this session was organized in advance of the report back from the three themed dialogues over the last several weeks, mostly because I see like almost a very bare minimum acknowledgement of the themes that were discussed, which relate to governance, relate to social and equity concerns, and relate to any sort of kind of integrative strategies. And, you know, want to just put my I guess, critical reflections on how this could have been organized better. And, you know, I think part of that, the result of that is that the discussion that we just had feels so very disconnected from where national dialogues are on, especially around the role of Indigenous peoples. And, you know, I want to obviously acknowledge the land acknowledgement at the very beginning, but then have to criticize the way in which we talk about natural resources without talking about whose land we're on. And, you know, I acknowledge Warren, I think you made some, you know, few main kind of minor remarks about the role of Indigenous peoples. I find it pretty shocking that when we talk about Arctic exploration, we're not talking about Inuit self-determination and sovereignty. I also find it pretty shocking that we're not talking about any sort of hint to the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. It's a kind of a sad state of affair for us to say that the duty to consult and accommodate is sufficient in making sure that, you know, First Nations, Métis, and Inuit voices are included in these conversations. It also feels extremely disconnected from what many of our communities are experiencing right now, which is to say, not only are we dealing with, you know, ongoing effects of settler colonialism, but we're also dealing with the kind of historical chronic underfunding of First Nations by, you know, subsequent governments. And it's you know, I just find it bizarre that this is where we're having this dialogue. And so I guess my, you know, my question for all the panelists is to reflect, based on your experience on kind of the role of, I guess, Canada's nation-to-nation relationship, and would love to hear how that can relate to the rest of this conference, which one thing that I think I spoke about in the theme 1 on governance cannot be separated from land control and jurisdiction over land. And it's interesting how this actually is just illustrative of that separation. So Chimigwich, and thanks for giving me this opportunity.
Thank you. Yeah, Warren?
So first off, thanks to Graham for raising that. I think that certainly from my perspective, there was never meant to be any disrespect or downplaying the role of Indigenous peoples on the land. You know, we were given 5 minutes to talk about some of the key issues, and I thought that I had raised that as a key issue, you know, that we need to be working with Indigenous peoples, and that Indigenous peoples and settler Canadians can build a viable bioeconomy, but that the Indigenous peoples have a key role to play there. So if I didn't get that across, I apologize, and I do want to stress that. I think that there is no way forward unless we embrace that. And I do note that there's some really interesting comments in the chat, including questions about you know, good examples of Indigenous-led circular bioeconomies. I would actually argue that the way that Indigenous peoples have used the land for, you know, countless generations has been circular. There's been circularity built into the approach that these peoples used, and that there's a lot of things that we can learn from that. And you know, I don't know about an existing commercial circular bioeconomy, and I think we could get into those discussions, but there are many lessons to take from it. So thanks for raising that, Graham. It was really important.
Thank you. Other interventions?
I would just add to what Warren said. I also meant no disrespect. I'm also not, just in terms of context, I'm not, I don't work for any oil and gas company in terms of the actual activities. I am a researcher and from a third-party organization. I think there's both been tensions and disruption of land use and traditional way of life from the sector, but there's also some good examples of partnerships that have developed over the years as well, and hopefully greater respect that has emerged.
Thank you. So Shiny Mickey, you had a few questions.
Sorry, I'm just getting my camera there so I can see people. Hello. Yeah, so I'll start with the first one. Just scrolling up. There's a lot of comments on there. So the question was for Elaine, and I'm seeing an increase for a request from Indigenous communities across Canada to start their own community garden initiatives and food forest to be more sustainable. And I was going to ask her if she knew of any research on the climate change impacts on economic implications for sustainable agricultural operations, more specifically those bee operations, because I think having some solid research would help support and strengthen communities' applications to receive funding support for their projects.
Okay, thanks very much for your question. In terms of the climate impacts, adaptation, vulnerability research that has been done in Canada, it's most in relation to crops, grassland, and not in relation to community gardens, unfortunately. So, and the role of bees, for instance, but mind you, that is dealt with in biological circles quite a bit. So that is a gap that you've rightly pointed out. The role of, say, community gardens in urban aspects has not been well addressed in it, to my viewpoint, in the agriculture impacts and adaptations. We still have a long ways to go, of course, and that's a good research gap to add in terms of food security for urban aspects and certainly for rural communities as well as the urban communities. So thank you.
You're welcome. It's not even just food security, it's more food sovereignty. It's Indigenous people having sovereign decision-making ability of their own ability to create their own food. More with COVID, we're noticing there was like a mad scramble for people to want a garden, and there was like a big demand for traditional foods and bush foods and traditional and gardening and harvesting those vegetables. So I noticed that there wasn't a lot of supports for that. There was like all the last minute supports to like try and funnel some COVID funding to the communities, but where was the sustainable plans in place or the research that they could have went to and resources? I don't know, I just found that it was a huge gap, and I just wanted to make that aware.
Right. I should add that in terms of food and security and sovereignty, we have done a bit of work in terms of country food availability and impacts by drought and extreme and excessive moisture. So we found that in terms of Indigenous communities and their access to country foods, that is really affected by drought and floods, and especially in terms of, say, floods erasing or confusing the approaches, the pathways, and the traditional areas where people have, say, been fishing or gathering fruits and vegetables. Thank you.
Thank you. Just I want to remind you that after that, there will be a discussion for everybody on the team. So we will not have time to take all the questions, but then you will be able to continue the discussion. So Roger.
Thank you. Thank you for that. I'm not going to turn on my camera for a number of reasons. I apologize. On the Aboriginal issue, which is quite interesting, is that I've been having discussions with various countries around the world that have Aboriginal communities, particularly in Australia and New Zealand. And one of the things that has become very obvious, and it links to my point that I made there, is that when you start to take a solution-oriented focus, the robustness and reality of those solutions is greatly increased by including Aboriginal knowledge and information. And this is getting more and more recognized. The difficulty is how do you enhance the access and dissemination of that knowledge and information beyond the traditional science, particularly so that you can get it to people that require those decisions. But my other point I wanted to make is that the more solution-oriented focus is vital if we're to move forward. We we know a lot about impacts. We know a lot about resist. Not enough yet, but we still know a lot. Where we fall apart is on solutions, implementation, and the whole latter part of the adaptation process. So we really need to start looking at that. And that requires engagement of different disciplines, including the behavioral scientists and the transdisciplinary stakeholder knowledge. And it's really getting at to really, we don't value, you know, it's difficult to value resilience and adaptation if we focus only on economics, insurance, and that type of information. That has limits value, but it is limited value. We better need to understand the different perspectives of that value in Canada's natural resource sectors, including the Indigenous people. And I've seen evidence in different places in the world, and one you would think would be most difficult would be coal mining towns in Australia, where they are fully behind adaptation, mitigation, and adaptation, because they recognize that this is their future, their children's future, and their community's future. But these also come with an understanding of there needs to be an investment. And therefore, what is the investments that's needed in skills development, training, knowledge, and other things? And that has to be clearly put forward so that that comes out. Thank you.
Thank you. Anybody wants to comment on that? Okay, so I'll put in a question, the last question of this for this panel from Catherine Harrison. Then I will go back, and I already announced the last questions for you. Is there a research, an issue that you feel should really be addressed at the moment is crucial? So before we get there, Catherine Harrison.
You caught me just before I have to leave to a department meeting, but my question, but hey, this is better. So my question is, we've been hearing a lot over the last 1 to 2 years about the Canadian oil industry's goal to match the best carbon extraction intensity in the world and eventually get to net zero. But my question is, aren't there, if we're already on average above, above the global average, aren't all of those other producers ahead of us, and won't they be trying to stay ahead and reduce their carbon intensity as well? The sort of premise that we'll match the best, as it's expressed, often seems to assume that they're not going to be trying to improve either. So, and there's been some interesting things in the chat, but I would love to hear more.
Thank you.
Really good, really complicated question. Let me try to do it justice. So we've been doing global emission accounting now for a while, and we've been crawling through basins. I'd say the first thing we found is the Canadian assets range from, we do the full spectrum, being very low to being very high. When we look at other basins, we find similar variability. And so a lot of the estimates been done today that we find are averages, average of an average, because of the data complexity required to do an entire basin. You can think of it modeling every well in the Permian. That's going to take a long time. So it needs a data analytics side. Point I'm trying to getting at is we see incredible variability in every play. Some variability, it can be as much as 9 or 10 times in terms of intensity difference within one play. And so our view right now is we think competition is going to be more dynamic than this play being worse than that play, because we see that variability in that play, right? And so, and to take the example of the Canadian oil sands, we see it about half, the upper half, beginning on par to upper half. Most of it's correlated towards the lower bottom portion of that, but it is at a disadvantaged position and when we look at it today. But there is an incredible variability in all those plays. And if you consider the scale of half, what is half? It's 50 million barrels globally. So it's half of the sector it's competing with. And so the opportunity is how fast can they decarbonize, or can they keep pace with other assets? And that is a hard question to answer, because it's going to depend on the composition of those other assets, where their emissions come from, and the technologies. And the technologies are not universally deployable. You can think of a high emission estimate, or an asset with a lot of methane That might be an easy way to decarbonize fast, but not everybody looks like that. So you've got this asymmetry in profiles, you've got asymmetry in technology, you've got overlapping emissions. Our view is going to be a multi-dimensional chase to drop that intensity from the sector.
You haven't actually addressed my question, which is not whether there are gains to be had within Canadians' production, but aren't there also gains to be had in all of those plays that are already in the bottom half of carbon intensity of extraction? So can't they do it cheaper and move ahead at the same time we're doing it? Won't we still be disadvantaged?
I don't have an answer for you, because as it's going to depend on their actual composition. And that's well to well. And I'd say a big factor is productivity of the wells too. So the denominator, when we look at this, is a big factor. So a lot of emission reductions or intensity improvements can come from improvements in productivity. I think it's a race. I don't think it's a case that the lower are necessarily advantaged to reduce more than the higher. I think it's a deployment of technology, and it could be a shifting of positions.
It's a race where we're behind.
Thank you.
Sorry, I don't know that either.
But have to move, but that's a good point. So if you have like 30 seconds to answer my question each, or no, less than a minute, what do you see as a main research question that should be addressed? It can be fundamental, psychology, human sciences, whatever, economics. So you're free. So I'll start with Elaine, who was.
Sure. Thank you. Well, let me perhaps start with the integration, and I've got a couple other points. So in terms of assessing the implications of climate for agriculture, it's important for integration to occur in terms of not only working with economists, of course, climate scientists, values experts, and governance experts, and we have opportunities, we have cases of using all of those. So the research issues that are most crucial are for agriculture, and other issues actually are the conflict between sectors for water and the availability of water for agriculture, compounded by increasing risk of those hazards, especially drought and even excessive moisture, causing all sorts of problems with soil erosion. So those are just some top sort of research aspects to consider. Thanks.
Thank you. Rémi?
Well, I think if going forward, I think having multiple disciplines working together in teams, having economists, having biologists, ecologists, working together to see the impacts, and people in finance as well, see the impacts of climate change and trying to find actual methods to deal with adaptation on specific projects. I think that's going to be key. And this is the kind of applied research that it's not something that you usually get in grad school. I mean, I'm relatively fresh out of grad school. It's something that sometimes you need to build teams to work together, develop projects together, get funding together, and have people from different perspectives to make sure that we enlighten public policy. I think that's the.
Warren?
Yeah, so I think our big challenge is to reassess our goals and the way that we get to those goals. So the intervention that Graham made and his points around co-governance, I think, are absolutely right. I think that if we're going to be moving forward, we need to move forward within that kind of a framework. But we need to rethink what we're trying to get to. And I think we need to stop casting this as just an energy problem. You know, if we can switch up a few of our energy sources, that we've solved the issue. I think that in fact, the problem is much deeper, and it's about how do we move towards a more sustainable and long-term approach to managing the resources that we have.
Thank you. And Kevin?
First of all, I want to thank everybody for the discussion. It was really good. I think when I look at the oil sector, the questions around how do you ensure competitiveness, and that part of that competitiveness is around adaptation, decarbonization, and investments in other areas in terms of value chain and other types of fuels and energy. I think that's an important part of it. And then another part of it is that linkages to the rural community and those workers in the sector, and how they can be part of that. And that includes, I think, those Indigenous communities that are in those areas as well. And I'll leave it there.
Thank you. Well, thank you very much to all the 4 panelists. I think it was very illuminating. Thank you a lot for all the people who participated in the conversation. We couldn't get everybody on board, but we'll keep all the conversation. All this will be archived and used and reported on when we do our report. So it's not lost at all. So please be certain of that. The next